welcome to the Peace Leadership webinar. My name is Dr. Evan Hoffman. I am a peace and conflict resolution expert with over 15 years of experience and a Brāv instructor. So this video is video number 2 on peace leadership skills. Perhaps you've viewed my other video, Everyday Conflict Prevention Skills. These two videos, webinars rather, are part of what we call the Online Dispute Resolution Expert Package. So hopefully you've registered to take this training, and once you've registered at the end of this webinar, there's a video quiz, and you can submit the quiz for review, and upon successful review of your quiz, you can add this training to your Brāv 1 profile. So like I mentioned, this is video or webinar number 2. We're focusing on peace leadership skills, and this is part of the 4 video package. So upcoming videos will include preventing youth violence, and then power, anger, and assertiveness. So in terms of an overview of this webinar, I want to cover 3 main topics. And by the way, I'm planning to run for approximately 1 hour today, just so you're aware of that. So the 3 main topics that we're going to look at over the coming hour include the need for peace leaders. It's a very good starting place to begin. Does the world need peace leaders? Or are we okay, so to speak? Secondly, what kind of lessons can we learn from past and current peace leaders? What do peace leaders do or have done in the past that make them effective at creating large-scale social changes? Thirdly, how to become a peace leader and how to inspire others to do so. So 3 main topics we're looking at today: the need for peace leaders, lessons from peace leaders, and how to become a peace leader. Okay, so like I mentioned, our starting point for our inquiry into peace leadership skills is to address this question of, does the world need more peace leaders? And I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say just based on the fact that you are here and you're part of the Brāv 1 platform, I would assume that you agree that the world does need more peace leaders, and that you are indeed budding peace leaders because you're already here. However, we can't deny the fact that there are a lot of people out there that would probably argue this point and say, well, no, we don't necessarily need more peace leaders. But the perspective that I would like to share with you is that yes, we do need more peace leaders. So it is probably a huge understatement to say that the challenges the world currently faces are serious, numerous, intertwined, complex, and require innovative, or what we might say creative, solutions. So let's just take a moment to pause before, I don't want to rush to the next point. Let's pause and kind of unpack that statement for a moment and think now of the current state of global affairs. And by global affairs, I don't necessarily mean what's happening only on the world stage, but just what's happening in the world outside, the world around you, the world outside your front door. You know, if you watch the news on a regular basis, I think it will become very, very evident that there are numerous serious problems. And if we begin to look at how do we address them, you'll see that they are interlinked, and that, let me just take one example. You know, like my next video is going to be on peace leadership, or pardon me, on youth, preventing youth violence. And in terms of a real example, you know, if we think about gangs and gun violence, and we say, okay, well, I don't want to give too much away from next week, but I do want to make a point here. But if we're talking about addressing gangs and youth violence and gun violence, and we say, okay, this is a problem, it's kind of one problem here that we're going to address it, the more you dig into it, you realize that it's a very complex problem, and that there are numerous kind of different root causes to this problem that need to be addressed. And so you'll say there's economic issues maybe that are fueling gun violence, there are societal and cultural issues that are fueling it, there are family dynamics, and so on and so forth. So you realize that a simple solution to gun violence doesn't really exist, and that you're going to have to undertake numerous different actions by different people. So it'll involve social workers and family therapists and community support workers and so on and so forth. So just taking one simple problem that we're facing, gun violence, and unpacking it, it illustrates that it's a serious issue, and it's intertwined with other issues, and that it's complex and it will require some creative thinking. And so if you're interested in learning more about that particular topic, I'll invite you to join my next webinar, because I'll be really digging quite deeply into some of that stuff about what drives youth violence. Anyhow, the point we're making right now is that most people would probably agree that if you look around you, there's lots of problems out there that need peace leadership. So Einstein once famously remarked that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. In other words, many, many, many years ago, when Einstein was alive and came up with this idea, he recognized that one way to move our culture forward and to solve our problems and to create positive social changes is through innovative, creative thinking, that we have to become more creative. Okay, so to further illustrate this point, I would say, unfortunately, what we're seeing all too often is the usual knee-jerk responses to these challenges that demonstrate the same old, rather tired thinking that created these problems in the first place. So let me see if I can try to come up with an example for that. One global challenge that the world has been facing, and it's been on the news quite a bit recently, has to do with North Korea and North Korea's development of an intercontinental ballistic missile, possibly tipped with a nuclear warhead. And this is a very serious problem, obviously. And so far, the policymakers, the politicians, the diplomats, and so on and so forth, the people that are usually tasked with resolving these kind of international conflicts, are feeling rather stuck, that there's not a lot of options. And so that, we say sanctions, we have sanctions in place, but let's put more intense sanctions on. So we're not really seeing any kind of creative new thinking that might approach the problem in a different way. And I'm just kind of firing this off the top of my head, so I'm not sure if it would necessarily work. But just to illustrate the point, perhaps if we viewed it instead of, if we said, why is North Korea acting the way it's acting, and what are its interests in pursuing nuclear capabilities and so on and so forth, and what if we reframed the problem as a global security challenge, or at least a regional security issue. Obviously Japan and South Korea have security concerns along with the United States. Instead of making it a problem of the United States with North Korea, take a regional approach and see if we could get greater coordination between lots of regional actors and regional countries to address the problem. Now, I don't necessarily know if that'll work, but I'm just trying to illustrate the idea that maybe with some creative new thinking, we can take different approaches to some of the problems we're facing. So the second bullet point here, indeed, what we really need are more creative solutions to some of these global problems. As Einstein reminds us, And we need people who are willing to implement the sometimes more difficult and riskier options. So such people might be deemed peace leaders. Peace leaders are brave in their courage to try out new things, to take risks, and to challenge the status quo. So, if we hopefully I've established for you now that, at least in my view, the world needs peace leaders. And peace leaders are people who can shake things up and find new ways to solve the problems going on around us. And unfortunately, when I was putting together this presentation, I began to think about who are the historical peace leaders. And the unfortunate part is it was very difficult to come up with a list of, like, say, 20 people. So I would encourage you to think about, can you think of any other peace leaders? But here are some that I came up with. So President Jimmy Carter, well known for the Jimmy Carter Center in Atlanta, where they do work around the world to deal with violence and ending wars and preventing guinea worm disease and working on polio, I think. But before that, as president, he made a landmark peace deal in the Middle East. Okay, Gandhi, who was a Indian spiritual leader when India was still a colony of Britain, and he led a non-violent uprising against the British that involved taxes on salt, the production of salt. Mother Teresa, who you all know as a saint, who is well known for working with poor people. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, a huge figure in American culture and widely recognized for social changes he created. The Dalai Lama, who I believe is a Nobel Peace Prize winner, if I recall correctly, exiled from Nepal, I believe, and has become a voice to inspire people to work towards peace. Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev, I don't know if you'll remember him, but some would argue that in the 1980s he was responsible for the reforms that took place in the former Soviet Union, leading eventually and partially to the collapse of the Berlin Wall that divided Berlin. And someone who's in my newsfeed lately, Liu Xiaobo, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but if you Google China Tiananmen tank man, he's the gentleman that there was a Tiananmen Square uprising many years ago. The Chinese government, if I understand it correctly, dispatched the military to violently suppress and break up the uprising. There was a movement for democracy and greater human rights and so on and so forth. And there's a famous picture where this man alone stood in front of a column of tanks, and he held up the tanks. And it took a courageous act of self-sacrifice, and indeed he paid the price, because I understand correctly, if I understand it correctly, as a result of his actions to try to block the military from breaking up the protest movement, he was consequently jailed, probably tortured or abused. I'll have to look into that. But anyways, there's a famous picture, if you look up Tiananmen Square tank man, where this gentleman took an action to try to create peace. So when you compare, this is what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this is 7 peace leaders. And I'm someone who studies and researches and teaches about peace leadership and conflict resolution and peace building. And unfortunately, like I said, I had a hard time trying to create a list of, like, say, 15 or 20 people. So The idea being that, you know, if we go back to the earlier thought, that there are lots of problems out there and there's therefore a need for peace leaders, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of peace leaders. And a lot of these people on this list here are now deceased. So who are the contemporary peace leaders? Who are the current peace leaders? And what are they doing? And if you think about, say, the opposite of that, you say, well, who are the war heroes, you know, that, or the generals, and so on and so forth. As a culture, we seem to have a lot easier of a time putting military officials and generals and great soldiers up on a pedestal and celebrating their successes and writing movies about them and so on and so forth. But you know, peace leaders seem to not get the same recognition. So, can you think of others? Okay, so the question is then, if we look at that small list of peace leaders and we want to try to learn lessons from them, we want to try to say, what did they do or what did they not do that made them effective as peace leaders? We can begin to generate a list of ideas here. And so the starting point is, I would say that, and I could be wrong here in the sense that maybe they just jump up and take action and they don't really have a vision, but my sense was that a lot of peace leaders have a vision in their mind of a reality that they want to create or a change that they want to create that perhaps others around them don't see. So there's a visionary aspect to their work. Secondly, you know, it's one thing to have a vision in your mind, but it's another thing to take that idea or that vision or that change you want to see and accurately describe it to other people and inspire them to work towards it and to have them come on board and support it. So you could imagine how many possible initiatives or positive changes just never get off the ground because someone who's a potential peace leader maybe has an idea in their head and said, you know, oh, I'd really like to see this change made in my school or my workplace or my community. But if they never act on that idea, if they don't share that idea with others, if they don't try to initiate a change in the world, then the potential of that idea is never fully realized. So peace leaders have a vision. Peace leaders can share and describe that vision with others and inspire hope and get them on board to support it. Peace leaders will denounce the use of violence and they will follow other admirable values. So Gandhi, for example, to go back to his case, he inspired his people to not. He's well recognized for nonviolent protest and really what are the methods of nonviolent action. And he was very committed to that idea. Many peace leaders will take selfless action for the benefit of the many. So in other words, they make sacrifices or personal sacrifice. So going back to the Chinese dissident, you know, he probably knew very well, standing up to the Chinese state, standing up to the Chinese military, that he was going to face some kind of very serious consequence. But he did it to make a statement, to try to inspire others, to say, look, you can stand up to military force. Peace leaders often work tirelessly in the face of extreme adversity. So in other words, they're working in very difficult conditions where all of the factors can be conspiring against them. It's almost like a David and Goliath situation in some situations where, you know, all of the forces are trying to push you down and you're just one little person trying to make a difference. And I would add to this, you know, sometimes the work of peace leaders, not only do they work tirelessly, but we should almost put in brackets after that, they work tirelessly sometimes behind the scenes. And so they're not always in the public spotlight, and they don't always get the recognition that they deserve. And maybe in some cases they don't necessarily want it, but I mean, I think that could be partially to explain why I had such a difficult time, listing, say, 15 contemporary peace leaders, because often these people are working quietly in the background to make changes in subtle ways. Well, there it is. It's on the next bullet point. Peace leaders are egoless, and they're not very concerned with taking credit for the results of their actions. Peace leaders take risks that could compromise their personal safety, their reputation, or their standing in society. So they may be discredited. I mean, that's a tactic that a lot of abusive regimes will take, is that they will try to attack the character of someone and discredit them, and that's a way to undermine their message. Peace leaders seldom operate as lone wolves. Rather, they build large and extensive networks of support for their efforts. And so that becomes a key to sustaining the change, is how do we build a network of support to have this change take hold. Peace leaders often seem to be driven by a higher sense of purpose, whereas you and I and kind of the everyday people are concerned with just getting by on a daily basis and raising our families and making sure we do good at work and at school. Peace leaders seem to be cut from a different cloth, in the sense that they seem to be driven by some kind of higher sense of pursuing some kind of ideal, like justice or liberty or freedom or peace. That that I'm putting all other concerns aside because I'm pursuing this ideal. Peace leaders have a great impact by changing the entire system or the structure. Peace leaders take advantage of existing momentum, or they can create movement when things are stuck. And that's quite a skill to have. And actually that links to negotiation in some ways. Peace leaders take action with a sense of urgency. In other words, I see a change that needs to be made. I'm going to commit myself to trying to make this change, and it has to happen now or yesterday. So in other words, they're driven by a higher sense of purpose, and that things have to happen now. So business as usual is the common phrase. Business as usual is no longer possible or even desirable. So they're saying this is a bad situation, or this is a situation that needs to change. Here's how we can change it, and we're going to try to change it, make these changes right away. Lastly, peace leaders have a variety of peace-building tools at their disposal, and they can use them or apply them in a very skillful way. So I already mentioned that Gandhi, for example, is more or less credited with coming up with some of the tools of nonviolent action, such as protests and marches and sit-ins. But what are some of the other tools that peace leaders may use? Well, here is one set of tools, and I would caution you that this is not a comprehensive list, and really there are many more tools in this. But if we begin to think about what kind of tools can peace leaders use in our community today to help to create nonviolent communities, these are some of the tools that I would say are important. So first of all, economic opportunities. If I want to reduce violence in my community, if everyone is prospering, if everyone is doing well economically and they have enough money to pay their rent and to put food on the table, then I would argue that violence is less likely. We can help to support the growth of nonviolent, peaceful communities by promoting inclusive dialogue as peaceful leaders. So this is about people wanting to have a say in matters that affect them, And I would argue that this applies from not only the family level, but all the way through to the workplace to, of course, national matters. And in some ways, I mean, that's why we have participatory elections, you know, so it's that you can have a say in how you're governed. But I mean, even in the workplace, you know, there's a difference between kind of having a dictator type of toxic environment where, you know, you don't have any kind of say in major decisions that affect you, and that can lead to kind of a negative workplace. And so one of the tools to overcome that would be through, say, inclusive dialogue. Accessible education, that's pretty straightforward. Having a variety of social support services, so if people need different types of assistance and so on and so forth. Community policing. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more when I get to the youth violence webinar, which is upcoming. But community policing is a different style of policing where the police are very much viewed as active community members and maybe police patrol in the neighborhood where they live, and they take a different approach to policing, and the intent behind that tool is that communities will be safer and more peaceful through community policing. Sustainable development and participatory planning, in other words, having a say in planning issues that are going on around you. So this is just a small list of different tools that peace leaders can use, dialogue, so on and so forth. But, you know, we could add to this, of course, mediation. And so mediation and dialogue are two tools that will be used primarily through the Brāv online platform as brave ones. And so you might find yourself trying to inspire or open up dialogue as a peace leader between two parties that are in a conflict, and helping them to mediate any conflicts and to maybe to negotiate new solutions to any problems that they're facing. So peace leaders are familiar with a variety of tools, and they know how to skillfully apply them. Okay, so they have a vision, they can share that vision, they can build hope, but let's drill down a little bit here and address this question about how do peace leaders create change. So peace leaders can frame problems in such a manner that new win-win solutions can be identified more easily. So what I'm talking about here is that there could be two parties in a conflict. It could be two members of your family, or two neighbors, or two people in your workplace, or whatever. And it's very easy for the people experiencing the conflict to just kind of throw their hands up in the air and say, you know, this is hopeless, it's a ridiculous situation, you know, there's really no solution to this. And what happens then as a peace leader, and again, this goes back to inspiring hope. How do you give people hope? Well, you have to take a positive kind of stance, and you have to say, yeah, you've got a problem, and don't undermine the seriousness of the problem. So you say, well, this is a serious problem, and I recognize that, and the consequences of this problem are serious. However, have you considered that we don't have to look at this as a win-lose situation where, you know, one of you is going to walk out of here feeling very disappointed and sour? And are there any ways for you to reach a win-win solution? And what would that look like? What form would that take? And so you're giving them a glimmer of hope, or putting a little light into a dark situation, and you're saying, look, let's rethink this whole situation and see if there's any kind of positive outcome where there's a win-win solution possible. Okay, so that's part one. Peace leaders create change by motivating others towards taking helpful actions, and they can build a broad coalition of support to sustain the changes that they are implementing. So we've kind of touched upon that before. I said you can't just have an idea in your mind, but you have to get that idea out there and then get people on board with it and try to build a coalition of support. Peace leaders create positive and lasting changes that benefit many people over the well-being of just a few. So that seems to be a common theme, is that if you want the change to be accepted and you want people to get on board, there has to be, well, in the international peace building literature, we call it peace dividends. So the idea is that if there's a country that's at war, there's two groups in that country that are at war, somehow they are benefiting from fighting each other. Their needs or their interests are being met through the violence. And that if a mediator comes and helps assist them to reach a peace deal, a peace agreement, there's a risk that the peace agreement can collapse after it's signed if the effects, the positive effects of the new peace deal aren't felt widely by everybody kind of very quickly. And so we call that the peace dividend. What are the positive effects of peace? And the idea is that if everybody can really quickly say, wow, this peace is great. I mean, now I can do this or I can do that, or it's benefited my business or whatever. If that kind of positive effects of peace can be felt by a wide segment of the population, then that peace agreement is more likely to be implemented and sustained. On the contrary, if the peace agreement is signed and only a few handful of politicians are benefiting from it and the regular people aren't really feeling the positive effects of the peace agreement, then the idea is that they're more likely that the war will restart. So in other words, whether it's a peace agreement in an international war or trying to create a positive change in your community as a peace leader, you want to create positive changes and you want to have lasting changes. And one of the ways to ensure that your changes will be lasting and sustained is to make sure that everyone experiences the benefits of the change and try to make it inclusive in that regard. Okay, peace leaders can also shake up the system to remove outdated or limiting rules and regulations. So if the system that they are operating in, whether it's a family dynamic system or local policies, in the community and local rules and regulations, if those are stifling positive growth and if they're stifling positive change and if they're stifling the kind of peace dividends for everybody, peace leaders have to get creative and think about, well, how do we work around those rules and regulations, or how do we undertake a process to challenge those rules and regulations and have them modified or removed in order to support our mission of creating peace. Lastly, peace leaders consciously use conflict as an ideal opportunity for initiating deep transformation. So this kind of mirrors in some ways the very first bullet point, but what I'm saying here is that when a conflict arises, again, it's very easy to view it in negative connotations and negative ways and say this conflict's going to be draining and it's not going to be good for us and it's going to create all kinds of problems and it's hopeless and I'm going to have to fight my way out of this and only one of us is going to win. A peace leader, not only do you inspire the parties to think, well, maybe there's a win-win solution here, but you say, maybe the fact that this conflict's arising is a sign or a symptom that some kind of deeper underlying transformation has to occur. And, maybe that means restructuring the organization, or maybe that means changing some way the family operates. What you're saying is that the conflict is an opportunity for positive growth and positive transformation, and you have to try to, again, transmit that sense of hope to the parties. Okay, so we're talking a lot in this webinar about how peace leaders inspire and sustain changes. And we've touched upon a number of different ideas up to this point. And I think to summarize it, there are really three very simple steps or three key ways to create a change. And again, this is almost rather overly simplified, but one, there's a bunch of stuff around the vision aspect. You can jump to starting a change, step number 2, without a vision, but without a vision, it's harder to kind of sell the idea to people and to sustain the change. And if you don't really know what you're working towards, then you could be working ineffectively and inefficiently. So I would say really in most cases you have to have a very clear vision. So that's the first step or the first key to creating a change as a peace leader. Secondly, like I've alluded to earlier in this video, you have to be able to take that vision you have as the peace leader and move it outwards from your own mind, kind of out into the real world, and start a change somehow. And then once the change is started, you have to sustain it. So very straight and clear and straightforward. So let's begin to look at then a deeper examination of each of those three keys. And so the vision of the peace leaders. And I don't necessarily have any answers for this because, you know, I haven't sat down and interviewed any peace leaders or done any research on this, so to speak. But it raises an interesting question, and perhaps you have some answers to this. Where does the vision of peace leaders come from? Perhaps it's from intuition, insight. Perhaps it's from reading philosophy, perhaps from religion, perhaps from spiritual beliefs. But the idea is, how come there's very few people in our society that are aware of all the problems around us and can develop some kind of vision about, hey, things could be different. We can make this kind of change. We can make this kind of improvement. Here's a creative new solution that no one else has thought of. So I don't necessarily have an answer. I don't know where peace leaders get their vision from, or if it's even possible to identify that. However, we maybe don't have to be concerned about that because we're talking about your ability to be a peace leader in this webinar and nurturing that. And so I invite you now to ask yourself, how can I develop my ability to be a visionary? So as a peace leader, you have to be able to develop a vision about something. And then where do those come from? So going forward, to put these ideas into practice, how can you develop your ability to be more of a visionary? Okay, so the second key then to peace leadership, like I mentioned before, was starting a change. And I would argue that some people feel like it's such a big problem that we're facing. What can little old me do? And that, you know, I'm not going to take any actions or any changes until, you know, lots of changes all have to happen at once. And I would say yes, in some circumstances that might be preferable to undertake a whole lot of action really quickly. However, I would argue on the contrary that in some ways no action is too small. And I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of the butterfly effect, but the butterfly effect was discovered, if I recall correctly, by a biologist many years ago, who basically his theory was, as he studied global ecosystems and the interconnectedness of the different things on the planet, different systems and so on and so forth, the famous butterfly effect is that if a butterfly flaps its wings in Japan, it can create a rainstorm on the other side of the planet. And the idea being that one small change, one small action on one side of the planet, because everything is so interlinked and interconnected, can create this huge effect somewhere else in the system. So that's why I have on the right side of this slide this idea of different ripples of change. And I would say create small ripples that grow outwards. And that is actually called the snowball effect, which is different from the butterfly effect. But the snowball effect is, if you are someone that lives where there's snow, or if you've ever visited a place with snow, and you've made a snowman, you know very well that you start with a very small handful of snow, a snowball, in your mitts or your gloves, and you pack that down, and the idea is that you roll it and roll it and roll it, and before you know it, it's picking up so much snow that it's spiraling out of control and it's growing huge. So the idea is that in some cases, you know, no action is too small. We can initiate change by triggering a very small action that can grow and ripple throughout the system. So in other words, some people never make it past this point as peace leaders. They'll have a great vision, but then they just say, well, I don't know how to get started. I don't know where to go with this vision. I can't get this change happening. And some people get caught up in their own mind and their own thinking, and we call that the paralysis of analysis, where they keep on analyzing and reanalyzing the situation and thinking of, well, the what if this and what if that, and did we consider this and did we consider that, and they spend so much time overthinking things and analyzing things that they don't ever actually do anything. Paralysis of analysis. And so I would argue that in some cases you just have to set that aside and say, we've thought this through enough, let's start a change. Okay, so then you've got your vision, you've started your change, and of course, you know, if that change collapses after an hour or a day or doesn't last a month or a year, this all speaks to the importance of trying to find ways to sustain the changes you're creating as peace leaders. So one of the ideas here is creating critical mass, and this is a theory that basically says for any kind of like change that's going to occur, it takes one person to be the instigator of the change, or the peace leader, or the visionary, and that when you're looking at, say, like a group of people, that one peace leader may get like a follower or 2 followers or 3 followers, and then that grows to 5 or 6 or 7, and at first they're kind of viewed as outcasts and strange people because they're doing things differently, but eventually what happens is there's called the tipping point, and you get enough people on board with your cause that it reaches a tipping point, and then everything kind of flips and everything changes, and then you suddenly accumulate a critical mass where now you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people making the change that you instigated. So there's a famous video clip that I usually show when I teach this idea to different university students. And unfortunately, I don't have the video clip here, but I can quickly talk you through it because it's a funny little example. There's a video clip on YouTube. You can probably find it later. It's a guy at a dance festival, outdoor music festival, and he's up on a hill. And basically, he's dancing by himself kind of in a funny way, and everyone else is sitting kind of looking at him and pointing and laughing. And so he is the visionary. He is the person outside the box. He is the person doing things differently. What happens is one other gentleman walks over and starts dancing with him, and dancing kind of in a weird, crazy, funny way. And then 2 or 3 people come over, and then 4 or 5. And then suddenly there's just a mass, people just start streaming from all over the hill, and suddenly there's like 50 or 100 people all dancing at once. So all it took was this one gentleman to kind of illustrate, you know, like, hey guys, you can get up and stand on this hill and start dancing, and then everybody kind of joined him. So a great example of creating a critical mass and reaching a tipping point. So I've kind of alluded to this before, but one of the ways, this is more of a practical tip rather than a large kind of theoretical way to sustain a change, but if you create a change, you can sustain it by linking it to systems and getting buy-in from the people in those systems. So imagine, you're trying to work with the local school system to implement, a new anti-bullying program in the school. So as a peace leader, you're saying, bullying is a problem that we want to address, and I have a vision for how we can do that. And, you could get maybe some buy-in, like maybe from one teacher, to try to set up an anti-bullying program. But if it's not tied into the rest of the school, then no one's going to come to the program, and it's not going to get any support, and no one will show up. But if you kind of ready the ground for your program by giving a presentation to the parent teacher association and getting all of their support, and they get on board with it, and then you have meetings with all of the other teachers in the school, and you have meetings with the principal and the vice principal, and you're working within the system there to get a bunch of people on board with your vision. And you might have to make some different policy changes to help have your program really integrated into the school system. So instead of just having your changes kind of free floating and disconnected from things and being crushed by the current system, you can take deliberate, conscious steps to tie your change that you're trying to create into existing systems and institutions, get buy-in from the people in those systems, and get them on your side and get them supporting your efforts. And sometimes that takes what we call a champion within the system, where you have one person, usually in a higher up position, who subscribes to your idea and who does support it and who does buy into it, and you get that champion on your side, you get them on board, and then what they do is, because they're already well integrated into the culture, the system, they put in a good word for you, and they say, hey everybody, at their next meeting, there's a new anti-bullying program happening on Tuesdays after school, and I don't know if you're all aware of it, but I met with the person setting it up, and it's amazing, and make sure you refer all your students to it, and let's all get on board and support it. So sometimes it just takes one champion within the system to buy into your idea, to have them promote it. Okay, conclusion. I would say we all have the potential to be peace leaders. What we're not lacking, unfortunately, is a shortage of opportunities to practice being peace leaders. So let's find and support the peace leaders in our families, in our communities, and our workplaces. And as I mentioned before, obviously by you being here and participating in this webinar, you are a growing peace leader. So let's find support for you. So let's light the way for others by making ourselves peace leaders. And I share with you as a closing thought that helps to kind of tie all of this together and hopefully inspire you going forward. About a year or two ago, probably about 2 years ago, I decided that there was a need for what we would call a peace leader's oath. And I put this together and I share it with you now, and I would consider you to think about whether you'd like to pursue this peace leader's oath. So I recognize that there are bad people doing bad things in the world, and that there are good people sometimes forced into doing bad things. I know it only takes one person to stand up against the darkness to light the way for others. I know it is okay to have high standards and expect others to follow them. This is how we evolve, how we progress, how we create a peaceful civilization. I will do the right thing when facing a difficult choice. I recognize that life is both mysterious and sacred, and I will act to protect all living things. I have power, and I intentionally choose to use it constructively. I am willing to sacrifice and be selfless in the pursuit of peace. I vow to live my life as a peace leader. Okay, so I mentioned at the very start of this webinar that in order for your participation in it to be fully recognized, and in order for you to include this training on your Brave One profile, you have to take a short quiz. Don't worry, it's nothing too scary or onerous. The idea behind the quiz is just to ensure that you listened to the entire webinar and picked up the main ideas, and that you will go forward applying some of these ideas in your work. So there are 3 questions here that are part of the quiz. Basically, you can type out your answers to these questions and email your completed quiz to Brāv at nextgenerationmediation@gmail.com. So question number 1 from the quiz. How could you encourage the parties to move beyond their usual knee-jerk reactions to a conflict to become peace leaders interested in creating win-win solutions for themselves and others? 2, how can you help the parties ensure that the changes they've come up with to improve their situation can be fully implemented and sustained over the long term? And so I'm asking you here to be very specific, and you probably only need about 2 or 3 examples would be great. The third and final question from the quiz: how can you demonstrate your peace leadership skills as a brave one? So how can you take forward the ideas that we've talked about in this webinar, and how can you demonstrate them as a brave one? Okay, so thank you for being here. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. If you did enjoy it, keep in mind that there are 2 more that follow this one, and you're welcome to join those as well. So please email nextgenerationmediation@gmail.com for more information on those webinars and how to register. So thank you and take care. This concludes the webinar on peace leadership skills. Good luck going forward. It's been a pleasure to share these ideas with you today.